Blood covered the floor of a small laundry shop in Taipei. A young man knelt in the center, his hands trembling, his eyes hollow. Behind him, 3 lifeless bodies lay silent. 9 days. That was all it took to crush a young man's hope and turn his silence into violence. To understand Thang Ying Shen, we must go back to where it all began. 9 days before the blood. 9 days before the silence. Part 1. Blood on the floor. The small laundry shop on Xinsheng North Road was silent when the officers arrived. The air inside was heavy, sharp with the metallic scent of blood. The wooden floor was soaked in deep crimson. Near the counter, a man and a woman lay lifeless, their faces turned toward the ceiling, frozen in an expression of disbelief. A few steps away, a tiny body, barely 2 years old, was cradled in the corner as if the world had abandoned her mid-cry. In the center of it all was Thang Ying Shen. He was on his knees. His hands, once those of an aspiring teacher, were stained red. His eyes were wide but empty, fixed on something only he could see. Officers who later documented the scene described him as calm, almost detached, as if reality had been stripped away from him the moment the first blow was struck. The weapon lay on the ground beside him, a carpenter's hammer, its wooden handle darkened, its head slick with blood. It was the kind of tool used to build a home, not to end one. According to the initial reconstruction by investigators, the attack began shortly after midnight. The shop had been locked from within, no sign of forced entry. The sequence was violent but methodical. The first victim, Ban Shihang, the shop's owner, had likely been struck from behind. His wife, Wang Yuqin, had fought, but only for seconds before the blows silenced her. Their daughter had no chance at all. There were no signs of theft, no attempt to escape. When the officers found Thang, he was still there, kneeling, breathing, staring at the devastation around him like a man who no longer belonged to the world he had been in hours before. Detective Lin Kuo, one of the first on scene, later stated in his report that there was no fear in the young man's expression, no anger, only an unsettling stillness that made even the most experienced officers hesitate. Thang did not resist arrest. He simply whispered, "I did it," and looked down at his bloodied hands as if seeing them for the first time. Forensic teams later confirmed that the hammer's pattern of impact matched every wound. The sequence of strikes revealed bursts of raw force, each blow fueled by something far deeper than simple rage. This was not premeditated murder in the way investigators were used to seeing. It was an eruption, a single moment in which all restraint failed and humanity seemed to collapse into something primal. Yet even in the middle of that carnage, there was an unanswered question. Why would a young man, with no criminal record and no history of violence, slaughter 3 innocent people in the quiet of a laundry shop? The scene told the story of how it happened, but not why. And that question would haunt the investigation, pulling detectives, psychologists, and even human rights advocates into a case that would soon tear apart the way an entire nation viewed justice. Why did Thang Ying Shen kneel in that pool of blood, hammer at his side, and wait for the police to come? Part 2. The last 9 days. Before the blood, before the silence of that laundry shop, there was a young man from the mountains of Chia Yi. His name was Thang Ying Shen. Investigators later pieced together his final days before the crime, retracing his steps from his isolated village to the unforgiving streets of Taipei. Thang was born in a community of the Tsou people, where the peaks of Mount Ali loomed like silent sentinels over scattered wooden houses. Life there was simple but unrelenting. His father, Thang Paofu, was known as a respected village official who fought to bring roads and electricity to their remote home. His mother was bedridden after a devastating accident, and the burden of the family weighed heavily on every child. But Thang was different. He excelled at school, quiet and diligent, with dreams of becoming a teacher so he could return and help his village. That ambition brought him to Chia Yi Normal College, a government-supported program for young men like him. Yet in his 3rd year, after a series of disciplinary warnings and crushing academic pressure, he made a decision that would change everything. He put his studies on hold, promising himself and his family that he would return. Then, in the early days of May 1986, he left for Taipei with little more than a few $100s in his pocket and a hope that he could find honest work. According to interviews with his relatives, Thang was quiet on the day he left home. He said goodbye to his father and younger sister, avoiding his mother's eyes as if afraid she would see the weight of his doubts. In his farewell letter, later recovered by investigators, he wrote that he wanted to find his own world before coming back. It was not the letter of a criminal. It was the letter of an 8-year-old boy searching for a future. Taipei, however, was nothing like the world he imagined. The city was a blur of noise, neon lights, and strangers who did not know his name. On his third day there, he saw an advertisement in the newspaper for a newly opened restaurant called Tianxiang. It promised high pay, free meals, and no experience required. For a boy who had never held a steady job, it must have felt like an answer. He called the number. A man named Qiu Fang answered. He told Thang to come in and bring his identification card. When Thang arrived, there was no restaurant. There was only a cramped office filled with people desperate for work. Qiu told him the restaurant would open after the Lunar New Year, but there was another job available immediately at a laundry shop in Taipei's Zhongshan district. The fee, he said, would be deducted from Thang's wages. For a young man with no money and no place to go, it was not a choice at all. He paid what little he had left and signed the paper. That night, he slept on the floor of a stranger's house, his student identification still in his pocket, unaware that he had just stepped into a trap. Over the next 9 days, the path from hopeful student to exhausted laborer became brutally clear. The work at the Zhuangxiang laundry was relentless. 16-hour days blurred into one another. He ate in the corner of the shop, slept behind a thin curtain, and woke to the sound of steam presses and the barked orders of Ban Shihang, the owner. Witnesses would later describe him as withdrawn but polite, never once raising his voice. Yet beneath the surface, the pressure was building. Investigators discovered that he asked for his identification card back on the 8th day, telling Ban that he wanted to quit. Ban refused. By then, Thang was not only trapped in the shop, but also in debt. That was the moment when hope turned to desperation. And as the detectives reconstructed the timeline, they saw it clearly. On the 9th day, something shifted in Thang Ying Shen. He no longer spoke of returning home. He no longer asked for his card. He simply kept working. Silent. 9 days. That was all it took for a young man with no record of violence to become the center of one of Taiwan's most haunting crimes. What none of them knew was that the trap had already closed around him, and the next step would lead not just to a crime scene, but to a question that would divide a nation. Part 3. Trapped and humiliated. The days inside the Zhuangxiang laundry blurred into a single stretch of steam, sweat, and exhaustion. Investigators later reconstructed those hours through pay records, witness statements, and the testimony of neighbors who often heard the sound of the shop running deep into the night. Thang Ying Shen worked from dawn until well past midnight, sometimes without a proper meal. He slept behind a thin fabric curtain near the back of the shop, his world reduced to the smell of detergent and the relentless hiss of the ironing press. Detectives noted that in these conditions, his mental state began to fracture. Every hour of unpaid overtime, every reminder of the debt he owed his employer weighed on him. He was not simply an employee. He was property. His identification card remained in the hands of Ban Shihang, and with it, any chance of leaving Taipei. But the physical exhaustion was only part of the story. Interviews with former residents of Chia Yi revealed a deeper wound. Thang came from the Tsou tribe, a community long marginalized by city dwellers who saw them as backward and uneducated. In Taipei, this prejudice was sharper and more casual, concealed in passing remarks and mocking laughter. Witnesses described moments when Ban would belittle Thang in front of customers, criticizing the way he moved or accusing him of being slow. What investigators later uncovered in sworn statements was even more revealing. On at least one occasion, Ban reportedly referred to Thang using a slur reserved for indigenous people, a word designed to strip him of dignity and reduce him to something less than human. Forensic psychologists brought in during the review of the case years later pointed to this as a critical moment. The insult was not just language. It was the final link in a chain of humiliation. Thang was already trapped by debt, stripped of rest, and isolated in a city that treated him like an outsider. That word cut deeper than any financial burden could. Detective Lin Kuo, who led much of the investigation, summarized it in his report. "You could see it in his letters," he wrote. He still believed he could endure the work, but the shame was different. The shame was personal. By the 8th day, Thang's attempts to ask for his identification card had stopped. He no longer argued. He no longer spoke unless spoken to. Neighbors remembered seeing him standing outside the shop one evening, staring down the empty street, as if rehearsing the act of leaving but never moving. Then came the night that changed everything. It began with another confrontation over his request to quit. According to one witness statement, Ban's voice carried through the thin walls of the shop, sharp and impatient. He told Thang he owed too much to leave, that he was nothing without the work Ban gave him. Then, almost casually, Ban repeated the slur. That was the moment investigators would later circle in red ink, the point where fatigue, debt, and humiliation converged. The insult lingered in the air, and though no one could hear Thang's reply, every piece of evidence suggested that something inside him shifted. And from that word, the rest of the story began to write itself. Part 4, The Breaking Point. On the night of May 24, 1986, the Shuangxiang laundry was quiet, except for the hum of machines and the faint rattle of hangers. Thang Ying Shen was exhausted, his body strained from 9 consecutive days of labor. He had stopped speaking hours earlier. Those who later analyzed the timeline agreed that he was no longer thinking of escape. He was merely enduring, holding on by the thinnest thread. Then, the confrontation began. According to forensic reconstruction, it started over his demand to quit. Thang asked for his identification card. Ban Shihang refused, reminding him of the debt. The words escalated, sharp and cutting. At that moment, Ban repeated the slur that investigators would later mark as the trigger. Psychologists reviewing the case described it as the moment of rupture. They called it an acute dissociative break. Thang's exhaustion, humiliation, and fear merged into a single violent impulse. He did not plan his next move. He simply reached for the nearest object, a hammer used for repairs, his hand closing around it as if it had always been waiting there. The first strike came fast. Ban staggered. The second blow followed before the shop owner could cry out. His wife, Wang Yuqin, rushed forward. She screamed. That scream was cut short by another swing of the hammer. Forensic investigators later documented the sequence through blood spatter and impact patterns. The blows were delivered with erratic force, each one driven not by method but by raw emotion. After Wang collapsed, their 2-year-old daughter cried out from the corner. Thang turned. No one could explain the next act, not even the experts who studied the case years later. It was as if every barrier between reason and violence had disintegrated in that room. When the frenzy ended, the shop was silent. Ban and Wang lay lifeless. The child was still. Thang stood in the middle of it all, breathing heavily, the hammer slipping from his grip. And then, something changed. The eruption passed, leaving only the crushing weight of reality. He did not run. He did not hide the weapon. Instead, he cleaned his hands, as if on instinct, retrieved his identification card from Ban's desk, and walked out of the shop. Detective Lin Kuo later told prosecutors that this was the most haunting part of the crime. He waited, Lin said. It was as though he wanted the law to come for him. Hours later, Thang telephoned the police from his relative's home. His voice, recorded on the dispatch line, was steady. "I killed them," he said. "I am at my cousin's house. I will wait." When officers arrived, they found him sitting quietly, his hands folded in his lap. He surrendered without a word. To some, this was the act of a man ready to accept justice. To others, it was the final proof that what had happened was not the work of a calculating murderer, but of someone crushed by a system that gave him no way out. As Thang was led away in handcuffs, the question that would define this case emerged for the first time. Would the law treat him as a monster or as a young man destroyed by circumstances too heavy for him to bear? That question, investigators would later admit, was far more difficult to answer than the crime itself. Part 5. Justice or tragedy? The trial of Thang Ying Shen began under the weight of public scrutiny. Court records showed that the prosecution built its case on a straightforward argument. 3 lives had been taken in one night. The act was undeniable. The hammer used in the killings was presented as evidence, still stained from the night of the crime. Witnesses described Thang's surrender to the police, his calm demeanor, and his confession. The defense focused on context. Lawyers presented testimony from social workers, educators, and anthropologists who explained how poverty, discrimination, and isolation shaped Thang's final days. They argued that his mental state had deteriorated under the pressure of forced labor and public humiliation. The defense submitted a psychiatric evaluation, which stated that he exhibited signs of extreme psychological stress at the time of the offense, but the court rejected this as insufficient to meet the legal threshold for diminished responsibility. In court, Thang remained quiet. He answered questions when asked but showed no resistance. His father, Thang Paofu, spoke during the hearing. He pleaded for leniency, not for his son's sake alone, but because he believed the case represented more than one boy's crime. His words were cut short by the presiding judge. The courtroom moved on to sentencing. On May 21,986, the Taipei District Court announced its decision. Thang was sentenced to death. The ruling stated that the brutality of the murders outweighed any mitigating circumstances, and that his voluntary confession did not qualify for a reduction in sentence, because police were already aware of the crime. The verdict was swift, and appeals were filed almost immediately. Over the following months, more than 100 intellectuals, activists, and members of the clergy signed petitions urging the government to reconsider. Newspapers ran editorials questioning whether the justice system had accounted for the social and cultural factors surrounding the case. They called it an execution of law rather than an examination of responsibility. Yet the appeals court upheld the ruling. The Supreme Court confirmed it. On the 11th of January, 1987, the death warrant was finalized. The following morning, at 5:40 a.m., Thang Ying Shen was executed by firing squad. Prison records show that he declined the use of anesthesia. His final words, recorded by a guard, were a request for his organs to be donated. After the execution, the debate did not end. Scholars and human rights advocates began publishing papers analyzing how the case reflected systemic inequalities faced by indigenous communities. Some pointed to the transactional nature of labor contracts that trapped young men like Thang in exploitative conditions. Others highlighted the legal rigidity that dismissed the psychological evidence that might have reframed the case. In the years that followed, Taiwan enacted reforms aimed at improving the rights of indigenous people and restricting predatory labor practices. But the name Thang Ying Shen continued to appear in legal studies and human rights reports. It became less a reference to a single act of violence and more a symbol of what happens when law collides with social failure. His story forced a question that still divides legal scholars and the public alike. Did the system deliver justice, or did it turn a tragedy into an execution?